Well, hello, hello. We're back again for another Wet Ink Wednesday, and I remain Matthew Orr of Wet Ink Games. And this time I have brought on to my show Daniel Kwan, a any award-winning podcaster, founder, co-founder of Asians Represent, a game designer, game writer, cultural consultant, actual archaeologist, recently published, all of these things. Daniel, I'm so glad to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I don't think anybody's ever called me an actual archaeologist before. I usually say like lapsed archaeologist or,
Labs archaeologist.
you know, ex-archaeologist.
I
It's all in the
I
past.
I had
Haha.
planned. Oh, good, good. I had planned to say credentialed, or that's what I meant by actual. You're not. This is something you trained for. It isn't just like that
Yeah,
you
yeah.
are freelance looking at pot sherds. You are
I,
you
I I
are
played in the dirt and I have things to show that I played in the dirt.
right. Exactly, exactly. So I was telling you before we started that this is the first time
Mm.
that I've spoken to you in person, and but I have heard you on Go Dig a Hole, and I've heard you on Asians Represent, and I listened to your actual play with Justin Eacock on the Terrible Warriors of Ross Rifles. I've heard so much of Daniel in my ears before, but I've never gotten to tell you before like that I exist, right? So it's a great honor to have you here to talk to you because you're kind of like I don't want to say you're like a podcast hero or anything like that. That's probably too big of it, but
Oh,
it's
that's too
like
big. I don't want
you're
that.
you're but you're definitely like you are someone I want to listen to because you have like capital I important things to say and also
I
besides
appreciate
that
that.
interesting things to say. So it is again an honor for you for me to be speaking to you today.
Oh,
Um
thank you so much. I also shout out to the Go Dig a Hole podcast and Chris Sims. That was like one of the first people I ever met while podcasting.
Yeah. Well, I like archaeology, and so I listened. There's a few of them out there, and so like when it was probably an episode Asians Represent, you mentioned you had been on Go Dig a Hole, and I'm like, oh, a whole other podcast about archaeology. Let me go listen
That's
to that.
awesome.
And so I listened to a few episodes. I think they're I don't know. The last time I updated the feed was empty again. So I don't know if they were switching over or whatever. But it's
Should
it's one of those
check.
things where I haven't listened to everyone, but you were one of the episodes that I
It was I
listened to.
was your gateway into that archaeology podcast.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
It's awesome.
And well, and this is completely beside the point, but they talked one of the episodes I did listen to of that show was they talked about some I'm in bourbon country here in Louisville, and so like they talked about the archaeology of like they've dug down under a distillery and they found the remains of an older distillery, and so then
Oh
they
yeah.
were it was this whole they called it like the Pompeii of distilleries because it was this palimpsest of buildings, and it
Yep.
it was relevant to my interests and regional and all that kind of stuff. So it was like, well, this is a great show. But anyway,
That's awesome.
uh so one of the other things that you are, I don't know if you're an innovator of or whatever, but like you could tell me the origins of it. But something that I've been doing for a year is I've been recording at various cons that I've been going to 15-minute game jams, which is something else that I learned from you on
Oh
Asians
yeah,
Represent.
that's right. We did that.
You did
Wait,
one years ago.
2019. 2019.
Yeah, it's been a while,
Hmm.
Breakout Con, and you made a game in 15 minutes, and I was like, this is incredible. I love the chaos of like you could hear the voices in the background because it's recorded at a con and it's not
Yep.
supposed to be pristine. It's supposed to be um and this is something that I talk about with in all the ones that I've done is like there's such joy in the creation moment, right? Because like being a publisher, like I am at this point,
Hmm.
more of a publisher than a creator. Like as a publisher, you commission art and you do the marketing and you maybe run a crowdfunding campaign and all of those things are integral to the whole long tail of the process. But that's all after you actually make something. So like you kind of forget by the time you're done with a book and it's out there and available, sometimes you forget the joy of making it in the first place. So
Totally.
skip all those other steps, just do it for fun, 15 minutes, what can we make? And I've been having a lot of fun recording those, and I have you to thank again for
Oh,
inspiring me to
wow.
do those.
Thank you. That's incredible. Like I actually, it's funny. You bring up like, continually like flexing your design muscles and stuff like that.
Oh yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
I've been one of the things that I've found that like atrophied for me over the
Mm,
past couple of years is like just the love of just playing games.
Oh, yeah.
Because I spent so much time doing freelancing, it was like, oh my God, this is becoming work.
Mm,
This is becoming like a job. And like
yeah.
I have a regular day job too. So like then I started like very similar to you kind of doing the opposite before design. For me, it was like I need to just play games for fun.
Yeah.
And it's something I started doing a lot more of. And it has in effect actually influenced my actual games work because I'm exposing myself to new things. I'm, flexing different creative muscles. And so no, I totally understand the feeling.
Yeah. I that that happens too. That I was actually talking about like thinking about some of the same things. I was actually thinking about what you just said earlier today, where it's like I was talking to somebody. I wasn't talking to them. I was reading a conversation on Discord. I lurk in a lot of Discords, and they were talking about the hobby and like whether or not the hobby is dying or getting better and like what's the future of the hobby. Like there's a lot of stuff that's coming out of WotC that nobody knows how it'll affect the small scale stuff.
Hmm.
And I was like I just couldn't I literally could not understand what they were saying because like from where I am, I'm like attending cons, I'm publishing books, I'm running crowdfunding campaigns. All of these are successful things. I mostly talk to other designers. I'm like, the hobby's great. Like, what are you talking about? But they're like, I don't know what they were experiencing, right? But wherever they are, it felt like something was dying regionally, or like the games
Yeah,
groups they're
people at
playing
my
with are too
game store
busy,
aren't
or
playing this anymore. Like, is
right.
the game dead?
Right. And that's a perspective I don't have because I don't play as much as I do other industry, because it's a job at this point.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I was thinking like maybe I need to just step back and just play games, I guess. I don't know. I don't know where the time comes
It's
from,
been
but
super helpful for me.
well, that sounds great. Well, what have you been playing? What have you been playing?
So I recently got back into playing miniatures games actually.
Okay. Okay.
So painting up like Warhammer stuff.
Yeah.
I've been actually super curious about Mordheim. Mordheim is like one of the classic Games Workshop games, and it's a narrative skirmish game set in like essentially a post-apocalyptic dark fantasy city.
Okay.
So I've been super curious about the lore of it and the gameplay mechanics. Um, there's a local shop that is absolutely wonderful, and so I go there. I play card games, so I play Magic the Gathering, but I go and I play this game called Flesh and Blood. It's a
Oh yeah,
tabletop
that's a
card
new
game,
one.
and it had a profound impact on my design work actually. Um, so much so that it is actually top of my credits as one of my inspirations for
Nice.
RPG. So play that, and then I play another war game called Bolt Action. So World War II game.
Okay. Okay. So that's neat. That I
Just a lot of
know.
non-RPG stuff, actually.
Well, sure, but that's the I I, I mean I you as a creator, you should know the medium you're working in and you should experience the medium you're working in, but you should not limit yourself to that medium only because the cross-pollination is always strong when you yeah, I read a ton of nonfiction. I hardly ever read like fantasy novels.
Hmm.
I'm reading history books and I'm reading science books and stuff like that, and that shows up in my work rather than uh, you know, yeah, as cool as all the zines are, like I don't read
It's
the
important to
zines.
get
I'm
other perspectives.
yeah, yeah. Uh it is. So is did you where did you start, Daniel, in games? Like is
In
it
games.
like
How far back do we want to go? Like my
well
origin story?
I mean like I said, if
Like the
if
radioactive spider that bit me? I
sure
could go there.
whatever you want. Like, what is I mean, obviously, we're mostly talking about TTRPGs, but like,
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, I've had people that like they're like credit playing board games at family board game night as a child as like that's how it started, But other
I
people, whatever your story is,
I
and however
started
you want to
playing
tell it.
tabletop RPGs before I started playing video games.
Okay,
Um, and I'm in my 30s. So I don't think that's too odd. But I started playing RPGs when I was 11 years old. In probably one of the more unique ways. My mom saw my brother and I out for a summer camp at the Royal Ontario Museum here in Toronto. They had a Dungeons and Dragons summer camp. I didn't know what it was. She didn't know what it was. My parents aren't gamers,
Yeah,
and I ended up going to this camp where you learned about science and history, and you played Dungeons and Dragons in the museum galleries. And I got hooked. And it's actually the thing that got me into archaeology too.
sure. I can
Being at
see
a
that.
museum, and I met this like awesome archaeologist who I'm still in touch with. We talk. He had a profound impact on my career in games too. His name is Dr. Robert Mason, and he did like a tour of the curatorial center for us when we were really young. And he would like bring out weapons, and he would like kind of like pretend to threaten us with them, and we'd be able to wear armor, and we got to shoot bows inside, like historical bows inside the museum, which is wild if you think about it. But I was like, I want to
Here,
be this
children,
guy.
don't
He,
aim at the fragile archaeology.
yeah, we set up like a target and stuff, but like
Sure.
he's this like cool British guy with a beard and had tattoos, and I was like, I want to be him. And so that kind of started me on my journey to archaeology. So I got hooked on D&D. When I was old enough, I started volunteering at the museum with the programs there.
Yeah,
Uh, when I was old enough, I started working at the museum. It's actually my first job. And I ended up working at the museum for like 14 years. Um,
that's I,
yeah, and when I got my degree, I ended up taking over the D&D program, teaching
yeah,
it like over the summers and on holidays and on weekends, um, while I was in graduate school. Uh, and Dr. Robert Mason was one of my supervisors, which is awesome. And so, yeah, I taught the program, and then I got to bring my students to meet him, and
sure.
the cycle continues.
Yeah,
And so I worked there for 14 years, and I
that's
think I must have taught like over 1,000 kids how to play tabletop RPGs.
I mean
Um,
that's amazing.
and yeah, and so because of that, I was kind of working in this vacuum while doing archaeology and stuff. And then I ended up through by chance on Reddit, meeting a local artist named Shell Khan, who works in RPGs, notably for like a lot of Pelgrane Press stuff. And Shell was kind of like blown away by the fact that I was doing this program, and I was blown away by the fact that somebody even thought my work was cool. Like I was like, oh, this is just a fun job that's getting me through grad school, right?
Right.
And so I invited Shell to
Wait,
my class.
of all possible grad school jobs, that is does sound like a pretty good one.
It was like it was an interesting loophole for me because we were discouraged from having the horrors of grad school. We are discouraged from having like employment outside of the university.
Yeah.
But I made the
It's a
argument that
museum.
like, well, the museum is a part of the university,
Yeah.
and so this counts. But anyways, I invited Shell to meet my class. We did like an art workshop. Shell actually did a live watercolor of one of the
Mm,
characters in our campaign setting. I still have the watercolor painting actually.
that's
Stole it.
nice.
Um, and yeah, and it was just like this cool introduction, and that led to me meeting other people, speaking at conventions, and one thing led to another, and I'm now this guy who does education in RPGs.
Yeah.
Simultaneous, like at the same time, while I was teaching, I was like, I wanted to teach World War One, and there were no World War One RPGs that didn't have like a supernatural element to them.
Yeah. I
Because
I I will take
yeah,
credit. I'll take credit for being one of those.
yeah, you're definitely one of those. And there were so many, and I didn't want that. Not because
Hmm.
they're bad, uh, but because they weren't the educational experience that I wanted for my class.
Right,
And
right.
so myself and like two of my staff at the time, who then became my business partners in Dundas West Games, we wrote Ross rifles. And we wrote Ross rifles with the express intent of having it be an educational tool.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was Ross Rifles then like the first sort of RPG you
It,
did, or had you already freelanced
I
other things or
had
made small things or
I'd made some small things before that. I made one. My first game I ever published was called Zany Zoo, and you can still get it on a drive-through RPG actually. And it's a like a one-shot, low prep, really rules light RPG inspired by the movie Madagascar, and it's
all
about
right.
animals trying to escape the zoo.
Sure.
And the entire RPG is actually a zoo brochure. It's designed to look like a zoo brochure.
Nice. Nice.
And again, it was designed at the museum with the intent to use in the museum.
Yeah.
And you basically decide, okay, what animal are you? All right, let's write 10 things about that animal, about your characteristics, and we use those in the RPG. And the GM is the zookeeper trying to hold you back from escaping.
Nice.
Yeah, that was my
So
first game.
then, yeah. So then, like, I mean, Ross Rifles then is like sort of the not grown up, but like it is the biggered version of that, right? Like,
Totally. It's like
if
it's the same concept of an educational game, but scaled up into a full size,
right,
product.
right. Um, yeah, it's and like I said, I think we were not recording yet. I told you that I've listened to you were on another Toronto-based show
Yeah.
podcast, Terrible Warriors, and you played Ross Rifles with I think with one of your co-creators and
Patrick, yeah.
some of the crew of there. And so yeah, the you talked a lot in that series about the educational value of like not of telling the story of Canada in World War One, and particularly the being as you are, it's kind of your brand. You're like, I'm going to bring in the Chinese Canadian element, not just
Yeah,
like Canada in general, but like, yes, and Canada in general, but also this specific
I had an
part of
agenda, and it's
Canada.
very much like I wanted people to know that like your idea of what a Canadian soldier during the First World War is not what you actually think. And there were a
Right.
lot of other people who contributed. And so yeah, that was Ross Rifle is probably the most patriotic thing I've ever done for my country. I want to put it that way.
Oh, I mean, that's, oh, gosh, I, I, I like that because, I, I mean, America is a very different place than Canada in a lot of ways, and I struggle
Mhm,
with that sort of part of the military aspect of all the stuff. And I've written about it, and it's in the books of World War of Never Going Home. It's there. It's particularly with the set that's about to come out. uh
mhm.
we finally bring in the Americans, right? A lot of the earlier books that we've done is like the British and the French and the Russians and stuff like that, and we're going to do the America book finally. And the I don't know that it's patriotic. I will
Yeah.
say I don't know that it's patriotic. So that's my relationship. But that's so fascinating that I'm glad for you that you have a thing to celebrate in that way.
Yeah, and you know what? It was really neat because it ended up being in a museum, which is a wild full circle thing. Uh, Ross Rifles got picked to be in the Canadian War Museum's
mm,
exhibition of war games, and they had an entire special exhibition about the history of and the intersection of conflict and games.
that's
And
amazing.
so they had like a lot of the like original like ancient board games that talked about military sims during like World War One and
Yeah,
Two.
yeah,
They even had H.G. Wells's
yeah. I was gonna.
original miniatures, and they had a copy of Little Wars there.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Little Wars is you can't
Super cool.
you couldn't have an exhibit like that without at least mentioning Little Wars, I wouldn't think.
Yeah, they had a whole
But
display. They had permission from they had lent the Wells estate had lent them the miniatures and
mm,
everything. And yeah, Ross Rifles had a full-on display, and
nice.
now being sold at the gift shop at that
Like,
museum, which is
I,
cool.
I imagine like I mean, I imagine like a glass case with like one of the Ross rifles in it,
Yep.
and then like the little book beside it, and then like your little placard, and like
Yeah, it was
is
100%
this
that. It was a glass case. It had the book open. It had one closed book, and then there was a huge, like 7 foot tall, like piece. They blew up one of the internal pieces of art, and it was actually a portrait of myself and Patrick,
nice,
and with like a big, like all sorts of text and everything. It was a full-on display. It was really cool.
nice. Is that like most of those museums, that's not like a permanent exhibit. That's like
No, not anymore.
it was a temporary. You had to. It was on display for a while, but it's in. I'm sure the copies are in the archives, right?
They're in the
Nothing ever.
collection officially. Yeah,
Right, right.
they
Nice.
have their own numbers and everything, which is really cool.
That is really cool. That's like it'd be that's a flex in some respects.
I think we've got to be the first indie tabletop RPG to be in a museum like this, to
yeah.
my
I mean,
knowledge.
it's yeah. I mean, I don't know. It's maybe there's some Gygax stuff somewhere in some museum somewhere, but
Yeah,
like
but they're not
that's
Canadian.
well, that's true. That's
That's
true.
that's
That's true.
that's the little like quote, the asterisk Canadian.
Canadian Museum. Uh, but that is very cool. That's amazing. And
But yeah,
so
that's my story. That's how I kind of got to
yeah,
where I am now.
but it's like you've included everything. It's like everything happened at once. You were like, I'm in the museum, and then I want to make games, but I'm doing education in the museum. So now I'm a teacher, and now I've got these credits, and it's just like it happened. I mean, you said it took 14 years, but it happened all.
Yeah,
It's like
from
almost like it
basically
happened all at
doing my
once.
first game to doing like Dungeons and Dragons, it was 3 years, maybe less.
Yeah, I mean
Yeah, I
that's
got contacted by Wizards, got in touch with me November of 2019 was when they first got in touch with me. And I put out my first game in 2017.
yeah. And I would assume that I mean I don't know. I'm not on Wiz I don't know anyone who works for Wizards. But you do, obviously. I mean, other than
Yeah.
I mean, like on the staff. I don't know like people I've met people who freelanced for them or done small
Hmm.
things, but like what I'm saying is I'm not in charge, right? But I would imagine that like the Asians Represent podcast and the sort of like
That was
I
it.
don't exactly want to call it like a movement, but like it is sort of like a force that you set out. Like you to do. Like I'm here to be noticed because these are the things that I have to talk about that haven't yet been talked about. Please notice me, you know. And
Yeah, it was
I think you succeeded. If Wizards called you up, you know, like do you feel that way, or is that sort of an
yes and no.
outsider's reading?
I think Asians Represent is very much like a here, yes, here I am, but also it's like here we are,
Hmm.
because there are so many people who kind of got their start on Asians Represent or got into the industry because of Asians Represent. Because like, one of us, not just me, but other people who were on the show reached out and was like, "Oh, you seem cool," or "We were at a con. Oh, tell me about your thing. Let's have you on the show." And now, look at the industry. And I don't want to say that like it's because of us, but I can confidently say that we were an important part of that.
Yeah.
And yeah, definitely the reason why I got into Wizards because of the show. Like they reached out to the network because they didn't have my contact information.
Yeah.
And that's how they got in touch with me.
So you wrote one of the, I mean, I'm sure you've written several things, but you did one of the library ones, right?
Yeah,
The
I wrote the Candlekeep Mysteries, wrote one of the
Candlekeep
adventures
Mysteries.
there, and
Yeah.
then I consulted on some other stuff that I can't talk about yet.
Ooh, okay. Okay. It'll be forthcoming, forthcoming.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it was a fun one, but yeah, and since then I've gotten to work with on like so many cool things. And I have the luxury now of basically being like, I'll only I get to entertain working on stuff because I find it interesting.
Hmm.
Um, I really only take on jobs now or agree to talk about jobs if I think they're meaningful.
Yeah,
Because again, I have the privilege of having a day job and being selective. And
sure.
so I'm very values driven about what I pick,
Yeah.
which is why,
That
I worked on Jiangshi twice.
right. You're setting this up. This is a transition point that you've
I
set up
got you.
yourself.
I'm a podcaster.
Yeah, yeah. Because this is definitely what you know, ostensibly what I did want to talk to you about everything that we've already talked about, but like the real deal big thing that I want to talk to you about is the second printing of Jiangshi and the you know I got out my copy earlier today, so you know you're not in the Haunting Tales book,
No, I'm not
the
in that
original
book.
one, but you're going to be in the new one that we're working on.
Yes. Yeah, I'm in the original core book, but not in
Yeah,
the adventure
yeah,
book.
yeah. You were one of the many contributors to the project, so you
Yeah.
know the you when I say you as Asians represent had something to say. The you is the plural form, right? I mean,
Hmm.
all of you had something to say. And I think about, I'd be sure. But so I want to go back in time a little bit and like ask you about like Banana. I assume Banana and Sen came to you and
Yeah.
they were like, hey, we've got this thing we're working on. We want you to be part of it because we want to know about I assume that they are like, you live in Toronto, you've called your company Dundas West Games,
Yep. Very.
you need to write about Toronto's Chinatown, and then that's the big thing you did for that book. So what is? I mean, again, I'm inventing the story. You tell us the real version, or you tell me the real version,
How I
right?
got onto Jiangshi.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so it's so funny. I I met I met Banana really early. Banana is actually on episode 5 of Asians Represent, like go way back.
Yeah,
And then Sen and Banana were both on episode 11 of Asians Represent, where we talked about first Jiangshi. We got connected through the whole like, hey, we're all Asian and we work in the scene. That's kind of how it's always worked, right? Um,
sure.
I forget which
Well,
con it
and the
was.
three of you are all Canadian too, so you're like in several
The
circles.
Yeah, the breakout con circles, the fan expo circles. So
Yeah.
that's where we all kind of met. And plus, like, the online stuff. Because when I started in TTRPGs, it was around the time when Google Plus was dying. And there was that whole like, where is everybody gonna be? Um, and it's weird because it happened again after Twitter
Yeah,
or X or
yeah.
whatever. But
Uh,
yeah, we
yeah,
met that
it's
way, and Asians Represent happened, and I so we met at a time when I was still kind of getting started. Um, and same thing with I think like Banana too. And Sen has long been like a role model for me.
yeah,
And
he's
and yeah, the opportunity arose to talk about Jiangshi on the podcast, and then I was, they asked me to write, and obviously because I'm from Toronto, I have, my family, like my grandfather on my mom's side, established some of the earlier Chinese restaurants here in Toronto. So I have that experience. Plus,
sure.
I was an
That's
academic writer and had
that.
access to all these resources.
This is like there's so many reasons to
It's
tick
like
off
all the
all the
check
boxes.
boxes.
Yeah, yeah,
So yeah, and it worked out. And they reached out, and I was like, I would absolutely love to. Um, and when they reached out again to do it, I was like, totally. I actually had something already ready to go. I had a concept that I had I hadn't been able to actually uh, publish or do anything with. I'd been
yeah.
sitting on it for like 3 years.
So did you? I mean, I don't want to hear any like dirty laundry stories or whatever, but it's
No, no,
like
no.
you're like, um, you're like, oh, we need you to write this thing, but you didn't write an adventure, so I don't know even I don't know all the details of like who was asked to write adventures the first time around or whatever.
Oh,
But like, have you had this idea since then? You were like, oh, I hope they asked me to write this too, and then they
oh
didn't, so
no.
now.
So the idea wasn't like a Jiangshi idea. The idea
Mm,
was like I want to tell like a Chinese sort of story in the real world idea. And I had worked on a couple of projects that I had been holding on to it because one project that I worked on had fallen through. When you work as a freelancer, it often one of the things that can happen is you work on a project, you get really invested in it, you do all the work, you get paid, but then it gets shelved.
mm,
Um, and I've worked on a couple of projects like that. Um, and I had this idea for an adventure I wanted to do set in like Manhattan. And I had been workshopping it around the idea of like a Delta Green-esque adventure.
okay.
Um, I published a like an indie game kind of like in the middle of the pandemic called Wicked Congregation. And it's like a solo RPG about being hunted by like a white cult in like rural America. It's kind of inspired by like SCP Foundation, the
Yeah, yeah.
BPRD, like Hellboy, Resident
Hmm.
Evil, about like an artifact that talks to you while the cult that worships it is hunting you. And
Uh,
so I had this concept of like turning the Bureau of Paranatural Survey, which was like my sort of setting, into a full-fledged game. And I started writing adventures for it, and I had all these like fake documents mock-ups that I had made, and I had this concept about like a ghost, like a supernatural creature in New York City, specifically in a location called Doyer Street, which is considered, I guess, one of the like a murder street, basically.
oh, okay.
It's people call it the bloody angle, and because in the sort of like the early 20th century, a lot of Chinese gang violence occurred there. Doria Street is in Chinatown, and a lot of Chinese gang violence occurred there, and there were tons and tons of killings by Tongs, which are like kind of like you could call them gangsters, but it's a little bit more complicated because it goes into the whole idea of fraternal organizations and the Chinese diaspora. But essentially, Tong gangsters wielding hatchets killed each other a lot in the early 20th century on Doyer Street. And I had this idea of a
Okay.
supernatural creature, an emergence of supernatural origin that basically ravages this street.
Yeah, as like a consequence of these things, or like as an
Um,
explanation for these things,
no,
or
as kind of like a consequence of these things. Yeah,
okay.
there's essentially the concept was that a sinkhole opens in like a postal service station. Um, there is a USPS building on Doyer Street, and my concept was that it was built over um like old Chinese buildings,
Hmm.
and during the early 20th century, one of these gangsters was like buried in the floorboards, and the
Hmm.
sinkhole basically unearths their body, and they've got unfinished business.
Yeah.
Um, and so when I was approached to do Jiangshi, this reprint and the new series Adventures, I was like, oh, convert to Jiangshi, and then
Yeah,
that was
yeah.
it.
I mean, like so many, this sounds like a great adventure hook. I mean, backing up just a little bit, Wicked Congregation sounds amazing, and I love solo
Thank you.
games, so I'm definitely going to go check that out. Um, uh, but these like this is the thing that is so amazing about like pulling games from history. Like, I've gotten to work on a few of them, and it is sort of like these things where it's like, can you believe that this happened? Like,
Yeah.
people did these things, and like you could go to the spot, and even if it's a USPS building now, it's like there's there's got to be some, that leaves a mark, right? That, like, whether you a psychic
Hmm.
mark of some sort, like it's so easy, even if you're not at all believe in woo stuff, like it's got to be it's easy to imagine a
Very easy to
impact.
imagine.
Yeah. And that if you are a person who is inclined to spirituality, or the weirdness of the world, then it's even easier to imagine it.
Yeah.
uh, so this is, yeah, I mean, a series of hatchet murders is a very dynamic basis for a thing
Yes.
to
And I
begin.
so I basically took out the element of like, oh, you are like this like weird paramilitary task force and you have to go in and
Right, right.
contain it, and then just lean heavily in on the initial helplessness of civilians,
Mm. So
and in this
it's
case, restaurant owners.
right. So is it is it a modern? I've asked this with some of the other people who are working on the modern this second set. Like, a lot of the
Hmm.
original tone of the game is set in the 20s, or maybe some other time period, but like, is this like, this is some redevelopment in 2027, or I mean
It
2017,
well,
and
this one's
is
set
it a
in
modern
2024. Set in
2024? There you
2024.
go. There
It's
you go.
it's explicitly post-COVID
Yeah,
in like what I wrote. But it has that connection to the past.
sure. Yeah, is that, gosh, I don't, yeah, post COVID, is there like, I, again, I don't, you don't have to go into it too much, but is there like,
Yeah.
is it just the thing, or does that also play a part in the
It
events, or
does
it's
play a
just
part. There are questions for the players about how the pandemic
mm,
affected them and stuff
yeah,
like that. I tried to limit it because I think that if you talk about like racism, talk about the diaspora, you talk about tradition,
uh-huh,
that sort of
uh-huh,
the intergenerational sort of tension, and then you throw in the pandemic, I feel like that is like a barrier that it's really hard to cross for people. And
mm,
so I kind of set it in the backdrop of like whatever quote unquote post COVID is. Um, but I made it as though it was something that you can interact with if you want. Like there is a
yeah,
prompt that asks, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected your business and life? But
yeah.
if you don't want to talk about that, you don't have to. And you can just focus on a million other dark things that I've written for you here.
Sure, sure. It is yeah, what I was thinking is like, there's not a lot of, uh, I mean, this is really, there's not, I don't, there's a few games that have dealt with it, but I don't know that there's yet been a game that's about the COVID-19 pandemic. It's been touched on, I think, by a few things, but I think I've yet to see the game that is about it, in that
I,
sense. But
I think it would be challenging because what would the game be about if you were to say the COVID-19 pandemic? Would it be
yeah,
about, you know, surviving the pandemic? Would it be about I could think of some
I,
really interesting concepts for a pandemic sort of like RPG experience, but there are so many different things. Is it like I probably the one that I would gravitate towards is like getting home because there were so many people at the start of the pandemic, people that I also know, some of my friends
Yeah.
who were abroad when the pandemic started, and
Yeah.
the journey to get home during the pandemic was like the story of a lifetime for many of them.
Yeah. It's, I mean, it's not my story to tell, so I won't tell it. But Stephen Wu, who did the artist, one of the interior artists for Jiangshi, like he was in Shanghai because he has family there in
Hmm.
like March of 2020, and he was like, I have to get home. I have to get home. Like this before it was bad. He felt he needed to go home, and there was there was some difficulties that he experienced, and yeah, but it's like he's like, I don't want to get here. It's fun to visit this city, but I don't want to be here for an interminable, unknown amount of time. I need to get home.
Yeah,
But he initially did think that that was a great concept for a game, but then like as a couple within a couple of months, he was like, no, 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 not yet.
it's
This is
too
not a game
it's,
to write now.
it's too real.
Uh, it's too
Yeah.
real. It's too real. But I think there's that about, like you say, I mean, there like I meant more like that, um, like putting it central in the events of it or recreating the events of it or whatever. But I think that um I think it's just sort of like as a thing that has happened, right? Rather than to not acknowledge it, right?
Oh yes, of course. Yeah,
To
it is a thing.
centralize the game where this is a central part of the story, and we are definitely playing the story after that happened, and so it's just a
Yes.
given that it's in everyone's backstory. Is I haven't seen that game yet, but again, that is, maybe it's out there. I'm sure there are games that are people thinking about those things, and maybe
Yeah.
I don't know. It's
I tried to approach it.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate that because it's so interesting, and especially New York, and like you talked about the sort of, I mean, the many things that were said, which by
The
I don't even know to dignify their stupid statements, but there were things that were
yeah,
said. It was,
the orange guy, the big orange guy.
yeah, yeah. Well, and not just him. I mean, that's a
Oh, and
whole
just
other,
the general pop, like a good chunk of the populace too. Yeah, it
yeah,
was for me, honestly, like working on Wicked Congregation was originally like a really therapeutic way for me to kind of approach that feeling of like helplessness and isolation and things like that.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
this was a different experience because I could talk about, like I could mention COVID, and it is always in the backdrop. Like if you're Asian and you're going to run a game set in our like the year 2024,
right, right,
it is there is no way in which you could avoid talking about the pandemic
yeah,
because it changed all of our lives in a deep, deep way, right? Like family dynamics too, right? Because like with
sure.
Jiangshi, like what
It's
is
about
at
the
the
family.
core of Jiangshi? It's family and food, right? It's
Yeah,
family and culture through the lens of food. Um, and it's done in a way where, you know, you don't have to be Asian, obviously, to play the game. Because a lot of the themes in there of like family, food, tradition, diaspora are felt by
mhm.
people who aren't Chinese. Um, but if you're Asian and you play this and you think about the effects of COVID on the way in which you even interact with your family members, just mentioning COVID is going to evoke a lot of thought about how the different player characters and even the NPCs may interact. Like
Yeah,
I think organically,
yeah.
without
I
much
think,
prompt.
yeah, I think it is. I yeah, it's certainly there. It's certainly there. So I don't want to, I don't want to end up talking just about COVID, but like,
Oh no,
are
yeah.
there other uh elements in the story? You've got as you described him, a Tong with unfinished business. Are there, the restaurant? Is it a certain sort of restaurant? Is there anything? What else do you want to tell us about your adventure to kind
Yeah,
of like
so
set
obviously
people up for it?
there's the whole backstory of
Yeah.
like the the gangster, the brutal killings. I also wanted to write a Jiangshi story where you could potentially have characters die because that's not really a thing in Jiangshi. But I wanted it to feel like there were like really, really high stakes. Um, I wanted to make sure that I gave people enough to work with so that they could either have a really, really dark, grim horror story, or they could do something a little bit lighter, kind of like Lost Boys or like Fright Night, um, which were like two movies that I absolutely love. But in this, it's very much like play this in one session, maybe two, but the
Hmm.
stakes are high, and city infrastructure sucks, and the city isn't going to fix this anytime soon. So it's up to
Yeah,
you to do it.
yeah,
And you kind of have to, collaborate with the rest of the neighborhood, all of the other businesses, uh, to deal with this Jiangshi. And so I
yeah,
wrote in ideas of prompts for basically getting materials from other shops. So you kind of think about the neighborhood and then using these materials and actually like performing an incantation and stuff like that. So I wrote out how to do that for everyone as well.
I love that because so many of the stories are sort of about the family against everyone else, and the family has the coming together, but not all of the scenarios are written to like bring in the neighborhood. And so
Yeah.
I like that's an approach you took. That's great.
Oh,
And
thank you.
I mean, I have always like, there's like 20 of these things that already exist. So like the things that are like different about the new ones are like the things that get me excited because, I mean, even yeah, I mean, it's not like there's so many of them that are like, oh yes, the standard Jiangshi scenario. It's not like that,
Yeah.
but it is like that's a detail I hadn't heard before. So
Oh, I'm
I like
glad.
that a lot. Um, great. Well, Daniel, it's been great to talk to you a little bit about all these things, but I want to give you the opportunity as we kind of move toward the end of this conversation to talk about anything else that you have going on. Like you've talked about being selective in your projects. You've talked about like I mean, Asians Represent continues, like it's not going away.
Hmm.
So what else do you have going on, and where can people get a hold of those things? So yeah, tell us about a project, and then yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
where can
So
people
if
find you?
folks want to find me online, the social handle I have everywhere is Daniel H. Kwan. That's Daniel H. KWAN. From there, you'll be able to find web store, my website, my portfolio, and all of that. Currently, I'm working on a game called Wandering Blades. Wandering Blades is essentially a tabletop RPG of hyper-violent, lethal melodrama. I wanted to write a game where the combat was fluid and dynamic enough that we would actually have rules that would enable you to replicate a lot of the brutal fights of 1970s and 1980s martial arts movies. Um, but I wanted to package it all in sort of like an old school, an OSR type product. And so
Mm,
Wandering Blades is what I'm working on. Um, Easy to learn, fun to master. The kind of the core tenets of it is that like danger is everywhere. It's simple yet tactical, and that fights should feel and the mechanics should empower a narrative that feels sort of stylish, fast, and compelling, all within this sort of toolbox experience. So yeah, that's what I'm working on right now. Quick Start is available if folks want to try it out. You can just find it on my itch.io store, danielhquan.itch.io. And we're aiming to release a physical edition, a limited physical print of the Quick Start at Gen Con this year through our publisher Plus One Experience, Plus One
awesome.
EXP.
Oh,
And
plus
then
one
yeah,
EXP.
yeah. And then we're going to do a crowdfunding campaign probably later this
Yeah,
year for the full core book, which is actually at this point pretty much almost written. It's kind of been the thing that
awesome.
I've been I've been doing for about a year.
And I read it, and of course I the quick start. I read the quick start, and I feel like it is like it is so OSR-y. It is so like
Very,
it's like crunchy in a way. It's like I mean, but then it's also like I like the way you described it. Is like it's sort of like crunchy, but not that like for a purpose. Like it's not just punishingly crunchy. Like it is like trying to capture a
yeah.
lot of different like positions and moves, and like it's not as simple as like parry riposte kind of stuff, but it is like it's there's a lot of options,
Yeah, there's like
fight
action
options,
economy. There's like an action economy sort of management is really important to the game. It has the lethality of like pretty much all OSR games. you can die like very quickly, but also you can also kill things very quickly. And the one thing that the protagonists, the player characters have, is like this mastery of chi that enables them to, you know, use incredible martial arts techniques and survive much longer. But again, that pool of chi isn't, you know, endless. And
Yeah.
so it's all about really being strategic with when you actually engage in fights, because again, you never know who you're going to like walk up to. You never know how dangerous somebody actually is. So while we really want to enable like dynamic and fluid combat that doesn't require any sort of like narrative finagling, like the mechanics support it. We want people to also think very carefully about even engaging in combat. And
Right.
so that's where a lot of my sort of my love of indie RPGs kinds of comes into play, because you know advancement isn't with gold like many OSR games; it's through narrative. And so yeah, it's kind of like I want to bring really stylish combat to the OSR. That's kind of my goal. And so I've tried new things in playtesting and design, and one of the things is actually obviously watching a lot of media and playing a lot of video games and seeing if I can replicate the kinds of my sources of inspiration using my game mechanics.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
far, it's been working. I the game can one for one, beat for beat, replicate the combat of games like Ghosts of Tsushima, or like Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice. Can all be replicated actually using Wandering Blades, which is pretty funny.
Well, so I'm not I haven't seen as much media as you have, so I don't recognize those titles. But I, for those of you who do, that's what it does.
Yeah,
I
they're like action video games.
yeah, okay. I see. I assumed they were anime for some reason. But the I'm not much of a video game person, so
That's
that's
okay.
part
There
of
was
it.
a lot of anime inspiration. Like probably like my biggest piece of anime inspiration was like Samurai Champloo was like a
That is
huge one. Um
that is one that I've
alongside,
heard of. That's one I've heard of.
and probably like one of the biggest piece of inspiration was this an animated movie called Sword of the Stranger from
Hmm.
2007. It's an incredible movie about this kind of like set in sort of like feudal Japan, but at a time when China is kind of trying to influence the emperor. Very interesting movie. Very good. Incredible action sequences.
Sort of the Stranger. It sounds good. So is Wandering Blades set in that sort of, I don't even know what to describe it as, but like sort of the fantasy version of the Edo period, or is it
No, not
set
at
in a
all.
fantasy? Is it set in like its own universe, or is it like
so so Wandering Blades is inherently like Chinese. It is a wuxia. So it's
mm,
inspired by Chinese wuxia media.
okay,
So the idea of like essentially like very low fantasy, if not there's no actual magic in it. But a lot of my favorite things are, you know, I love the Akira Kurosawa movies. I love anime. I love action sequences that they have and the stories that they tell. But culturally, and deeply infused within the game mechanics, it is Chinese. And it
nice.
will be published with a setting as well, a setting that I use for my homebrew D&D game. But it's called the Land of Blades, and it's inspired by sort of like Central Eastern China, particularly by during the spring and autumn period. There was a sort of a loosely independent state called Yue, and they're actually centered around Zhejiang province in China. And they're one of the I did my doctoral research, my field work was in that area, and B, they interestingly, this like only for a couple of centuries, this region of China was known for its blacksmithing and was one of the only times in China's history where people had a tradition of naming swords,
All
which
right.
I find like deeply, deeply fascinating.
That
And
is
so there's
well,
still a lot of that academic love in my
yeah.
world building.
I mean, first of all, yeah, that's great. We were talking earlier about like,
Yeah.
bringing in the nonfiction and stuff like that. So like, I researched this. This is great. But I'm just surprised that there would be only one of there would be only a few periods where swords are named, because that seems like such a
Swords are important, but the idea of naming swords is weirdly unique to this area. Yeah.
Yeah. Because like it's obviously I know European inspired media better,
Oh, tons of
and
sword naming, tons of
tons
sword
of sword
naming.
naming
Same
there,
with
and like
Japan and
same
all
in
of that.
Japan, and like their famous swords and in Japan and stuff like that. So like that's not a thing in China surprises me,
Yeah, not a thing.
um but uh but
But yeah, it's
then
a Chinese game.
it
And
is in this region, so that's cool.
yeah, and ultimately my plans like down the line are to like once I get done with Wandering Blades is to kind of transition more into project managing uh, different regional hacks of Wandering Blades. I'd like to do a Japanese one. I
Mm,
particularly would love to do a South Asian one because they have like a rich tradition of like weaponry and weapons combat. Some of the earliest martial arts ever come from like India. And so
yeah.
like I would love to see this system and this concept be used,
Mm,
in other Asian cultures, alongside like the themes of like violent heroism and
yeah.
Wandering Blades itself is like an anti-establishment game too, because wuxia is very much like stories that take place outside of the purview of like the imperial court, or the protagonists often act against the imperial court.
Yeah. It's the knight errant, or
Exactly.
it's if you've got to follow too many other people's rules, you can't tell as many different stories, I guess. I mean,
Yeah, the only rules you follow are your own.
yeah. Uh yeah.
Yeah, that's what
I
I'm
know.
working on.
I love the idea of like commissioning other uh, you know uh, are people to produce something that's more regionally based on something that they may know something else about, because yeah, like South Asia has like, yeah, a huge number of martial traditions of its own,
Incredible
and
stuff. And I think it also really is a continuation of what I've been trying to do with Asians Represent is that, empower, other Asian creators to enter the industry and tell their stories. And I see this
yeah,
as another way in which I can do that.
yeah. I think, I mean, I my my wife is Indian American, and so I have like an Indian father-in-law, and of course, like so many immigrant parent type situation. I mean, like
Mhm.
everything. The Indians invented everything, and it's always better because it came from India or whatever. And but he, whatever. It's that's just I can't you can't dispute it, right? Whatever. It's the way it is. But I have always been like interested myself to do work on like TTRPG stuff that focuses on Indian mythology and history and stuff like
Yeah.
that. But then I'm like, I've learned from listening to your podcast and from other just things in the industry. It's like I didn't end up doing that. There's other people who would be better at that than I am. So, yeah, somebody do it, and I'll be interested in it. So,
Yeah.
um,
That's kind of my goal with this, but I gotta get through this first.
right, right. Do the first one, and do well. And sounds like, I mean, if you've got a publisher, you've got to have copies at Gen Con in like 20 days, then that's you're well on your way. You're well on
Yeah,
your
that's
way.
that's in 20 days. That's right.
Yeah, it's 20. It's about, somebody, I saw two posts at the day of recording. Somebody was like, "Oh, it's 3 weeks away," and somebody else was like, "It is 20 days away." And it's 20 days sounds so much closer than 3 weeks.
Way
Um,
closer. Yeah. Oh my
I don't
God.
know why.
I won't
Uh,
be at Gen Con this year. So
okay,
if you see
that
Wandering
was what I was
Blades
just
at
about
Gen
to ask.
Con, snap a pic, tag me.
Let's see. I will. Well, I don't know. Could you, I'm gonna look
Oh,
up
if you want me
the
to fill the air, I'm gonna fill the air.
fill the air with something, because I'm gonna look up where plus one EXP is gonna be, because I pulled up the event map for myself just earlier
Yeah,
today.
yeah. You know what? Honestly, I think if you folks are interested in Wandering Blades, or if you really like the how I approach design, I mean, I think you're gonna see that in this reprint of Jiangshi, this adventure that I wrote. I
Mm,
think the reason why I agreed to work on Jiangshi in the first place was A, because I have like a deep admiration for Banana and Sen, but also because it's doing the exact thing that I like to do with my work, and it's you know put these stories in front of people who have never experienced them, and use them as use the game mechanics as tools through which people can kind of learn these new perspectives. So
Awesome.
you see that in all of my work in from D&D,
Yeah.
Wandering Blaze to Jiangshi to even Ross rifles.
Yeah. Yeah. It's you've been consistent in that. I think
Yeah,
you've
I
got
think
kind of
I
a you've got kind of a personal brand, and I think that's yeah, you're sticking to your brand. Uh,
yes.
I could not find +1 EXP on the list, but I will if I find it, I'll put it in the show notes for this. So
Yeah, I'll find out and I'll also let you know. Because
excellent,
I should
excellent.
also know this too.
Because people need to know what booth they can go to now that we've been talking about it. All
You
right,
should go
I
to
think
every booth at Gen Con because that's the
that's
best
right.
way to experience it.
All like 3,041 of them or whatever.
Oh my
Uh,
God. Okay, that's so many.
I think it's less than that. It's 30 rows, but I think they only go up to like 50 for each row.
I'm
So
the kind of person though that when I go to a convention, I walk up and down the aisles. Like I go to every single booth, or at
it's
least I pass by every single booth. It's
it's
I that's what I liked about going to Gen Con.
yeah, I was you've I'm sure you've been to Gen Con before, but
Yeah, I've
it's
been
it's
twice, yeah.
it's big. I don't know that I have ever walked every aisle in any one year. It's just it's big. It's big. Of
Yes.
course,
Well, you're busier at Gen Con though. The
well,
when I went to Gen Con, I wasn't as busy.
well, there you go. There you go. Yeah, I've only been to Gen Con as an exhibitor, so I have never had the opportunity to just wander endlessly. I'm like, I'm at this booth at this time, come and talk to me, and then the hall
And
closes, and
that's
then
where
I
you
go,
are. Yeah. You
yeah.
go to sleep.
Well, right, we go get dinner, and then yeah, maybe play one game, and then go to sleep. Yeah, get up the next day and do it again.
Yeah, it
That's how it
sounds
works.
exhausting.
It's exhausting and stimulating. Like we were
Yes.
talking about at the beginning, like I like the energy of a con is something special. Um, all right, this long rambling outro is now over. Daniel, I want to thank you again for your time tonight and for talking to me about about your career and like all your projects. It's been a real pleasure to have you on Wedding Wednesday. And if you've got any other places, I think you've already mentioned your itch.io and where you can,
Yeah, it's just
did you mention a
Daniel
link
H.
tree?
Kwan.
Yeah,
Yeah, DanielHKwan.com, and then that just goes to
dot com,
everything.
dot com, danielhquan.com. Like that's perfect.
Easy.
That's perfect. All right. Thank you again so much. And we'll see you on the internet.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thanks everyone to who watched the show and appreciate your giving it a like in the
Like, subscribe, hit that bell icon,
that's
do all
that's how
that,
it
all the good
works.
stuff.
All the good stuff.